On a stretch of state highway just outside a town nobody stops in, a motorcycle went down at 68 miles an hour, and the sound it made hitting the guardrail was the kind of sound a man hears once and never fully gets out of his ears. The rider slid another 40 feet on his shoulder and his hip, leather peeling, and came to rest half in the weeds with one boot still hooked under the wreck. It was 4:20 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and 11 vehicles passed him in the next 6 minutes. 11. Nobody stopped. A woman slowed, saw the blood, saw the patch on his back, and pressed the gas again. A man in a pickup filmed it through his window for 9 seconds and drove on. The rider was 61 years old. He had a wife 40 miles away who did not yet know, and he was bleeding out into the gravel where the whole county could watch and choose not to. And the only living soul who walked toward that man instead of away from him was carrying everything he owned in a garbage bag over his shoulder. He was 63. His name was Earl, though almost nobody in that town had asked it in 2 years. Gray hair gone past, needing a cut, hands cracked from sleeping rough through 2 winters and starting on a third. An army field jacket worn shiny at the elbows. And what nobody driving past understood, what the man filming through his truck window would never have believed, was that the wallet lying 6 feet from that dying biker held more cash than Earl had touched in 3 years. And Earl was the one man in that county who was never going to keep a dollar of it. A long time ago, in another life, men who wore a very different uniform used to go quiet when Earl walked into a room. Nobody on that highway had the first idea who they had just decided to leave in the dirt. And I need you to remember the number 11, because before that month was out, there was going to be a very different number parked outside a diner in that town. And it was going to be 150. Stay with me. This is the kind of story that only makes sense if you refuse to skip ahead. It started barely 2 minutes earlier than the crash, with Earl walking the shoulder the way he did every afternoon, toward the overpass where he slept because the concrete held a little heat after dark. He heard the bike before he saw it, heard the throttle, then heard the throttle become something wrong. A wet cough of an engine and a shriek of rubber, and then the guardrail. Earl had heard men hit things at speed before, in another country, a long time back. His body knew the sound, and his body moved before the thinking part of him caught up, and that is a thing that never leaves a certain kind of man, no matter how far down he falls. He dropped the garbage bag in the weeds. He did not look at the cars going by. He came around the crumpled fairing of that motorcycle, slow and careful, the way he did everything now. And he got down on his cracked knees in the gravel next to a stranger who was the color of a man about to leave. The biker's eyes were open. His breathing was short and high, up in the top of the chest, the breathing of a body that is losing the argument. There was a gash along the hairline, and a worse thing at the hip that Earl did not let his face react to, because he had learned in a field hospital 40 years gone that a scared face makes a dying man die faster. So Earl kept his face flat and kind, and he pressed his own bare hand hard over the hip, and he leaned down close and said the only thing worth saying. Hey now, I got you. You're not out here alone. That's the part I want to slow down on, because you need to understand exactly who was kneeling in that gravel before you understand what the next week cost and what it gave back. Earl had a fixed hour once, same as any working man. For 19 years, he had opened a small engine shop at 6 in the morning, 6 days a week, and the whole block used to set its clock by the light coming on in his window and the smell of coffee and cold metal drifting out the propped door. He was a big man, in a way that had nothing to do with size. Quiet, mostly, but when Earl said a thing, people leaned in without meaning to. He'd come home from a war that the town preferred not to ask about, and he'd put whatever he brought back into a steel toolbox in his chest and locked it. And for 19 years, he ran that shop and fixed lawnmowers and outboards and old British twins for men who trusted his hands more than they trusted the bank. He had a wife named Ruth, who called him a nickname nobody remembered the origin of, and he had a life so ordinary it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. And then, over about 4 years, he lost it, the way men his age lose things now. Ruth got sick. The insurance found a reason the treatment she needed was the kind they did not pay for. Earl sold the shop to pay for 1 more year of her, and it was worth it. He would tell you to your face it was worth every bolt and every wrench. And when she was gone, the money was gone too, and the house went to the bank. And Earl went to the overpass with a garbage bag and a locked steel box. He would not sell even the 1 bad month he did not eat. 2 years he'd been out there. 2 years of a town that used to set its clock by him, pretending it could not see him. And still, when a stranger went down bleeding on a road where everyone else looked away, Earl was the man who knelt. The biker's name was Denny, though Earl didn't know that yet. What Earl knew was that the man's phone had skittered out of a torn pocket and lay in the weeds, screen cracked but lit, and Earl grabbed it and dialed the 3 numbers that still worked on any phone in America, and told the voice on the other end exactly where they were, mile marker and direction, and the color of the guardrail. Flat and clear, like a man reading off a work order, no panic in it. Then he went back to holding pressure, and holding the man's eyes. And that is when Earl saw the wallet. It had come out of the same torn pocket and lay open in the gravel, and it was fat, the kind of fat that is not credit cards. It was cash. A lot of it. Earl found out later it was just shy of $4,000, road money for a run the club was making. And I want you to hold that number too, because $4,000 to a man who had not held 40 in a year is not a number. It is a temptation with a heartbeat. Any court in the land would have understood. The man was going to die, most likely. Nobody was watching who mattered. Earl could have that money in his jacket and be a mile down the road before the ambulance came, and he would eat that winter, and he would sleep somewhere with a door. Earl looked at the wallet for exactly as long as it took to decide, which was no time at all. And then he picked it up with 2 fingers and tucked it back into what was left of the man's vest, close to the chest, where a man keeps the things that are his. And he went back to holding pressure. Because some men, when they lose everything, discover the one thing nobody can take is the thing they decide about themselves in a gravel shoulder when no one is looking. The ambulance came at 4:31. Earl heard it before the paramedics did their count, and he kept his hand on that hip until a young medic with steady hands took over and told him to let go, son, we've got him, even though Earl had decades on the kid. Earl stood up, and his own knees told him, joint by joint, that he was not a young man, and he stepped back into the weeds and picked up his garbage bag. A sheriff's deputy took his name, because they take everybody's name, and wrote Earl, no fixed address, and did not write down the rest because there was no box on the form for the rest. And here is a thing that will tell you everything about that town. As the medics loaded Denny into the truck, one of them found the fat wallet still tucked against the man's chest, and he looked at Earl, the homeless man standing in the weeds, and something crossed his face that Earl had seen 100 times in 2 years. Suspicion. The medic actually opened the wallet and counted it right there, thumbing the bills where Earl could see him do it. And then he looked back up at Earl, like he was deciding whether to say something. Earl didn't say a word. He didn't say, "I could have taken it and didn't." He didn't say, "I held that man's life in my bare hand for 11 minutes." He just picked up his bag and he walked back toward the overpass. Because that is what the last 2 years had taught him. That explaining yourself to people who have already decided about you is a way of asking for something. And Earl had stopped asking. Now, you need to understand who Denny was, because a wallet is just leather until you know whose chest it wrote against. Denny was a full-patch member of a motorcycle club, and I'm going to name it the way the town whispered it: the Hells Angels. And the moment I say that name, I know exactly what half of you just pictured, because that is the picture the woman who sped up pictured, and the man who filmed and drove on, and the medic who counted the cash twice. They saw the patch on the back before they saw the man bleeding under it, and the patch told them a story, and the story told them it was safe not to stop. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you those men are all saints, because they are not, and they'd be the first to tell you so. But I will tell you what those 11 cars driving past did not know. That club, that chapter, was built on exactly one thing, and it was not fear, and it was not the cash in that wallet. It was a rule older than any of them, older than the patch, a rule that says, you do not leave your own in the dirt, and you do not forget a debt. And when a man does right by one of yours, he has done right by all of you, and it will be answered. Denny had a brother in that club, an older man they called Preacher, 68 years old, been riding since before most of the chapter was born. And Preacher was the one who was going to hear this story first. Hold on to him. Because Preacher is the hinge this whole thing turns on. The old head who would decide how the debt got paid. 20 years older than most of the men who rode behind him, gray in the beard and slower off the line than he used to be. And yet, when the call came through that a brother was down on a state highway 40 miles out, it was Preacher the road captain phoned first, before he phoned an ambulance. Because that is the order of things in a house built on that one old rule. Preacher was standing in the gravel lot behind the clubhouse with a wrench in his hand when the phone buzzed against his hip, and he set the wrench down on the workbench, slow. The way a man sets down a tool he knows he will not be picking back up for a while. And he listened, and he said 3 words into the phone. Which hospital? Then he went. He did not gather 150 men and thunder down the interstate in a wall of chrome, because that is not what a wise old head does when a brother is bleeding out. That only fills a waiting room with rage and gets somebody arrested. He took 4 men. 4, and they rode the 40 miles in the last hour of daylight, with their headlights coming on one by one against the dusk. And they did not speed, because Preacher would not have it. And every one of those 4 understood that the calm in the old man's shoulders in front of them was the hardest kind of calm there is. The kind a man holds on purpose, over the top of something that wants very badly to come loose. By the time they reached the county hospital, Denny was already on a table with a surgical team around him, and the fat wallet with the $4,000 in it was sitting in a plastic bag on a shelf in a locked room, counted and logged, because the medic who counted it twice had made sure everyone downstream knew there was cash in it, as though the money were the remarkable thing about that night. It was not the remarkable thing about that night. Not even close. Preacher walked into that waiting room in a cut with more miles on it than most of the staff had been alive. And the room went the way rooms go when men like that walk in. A little quieter, a little more careful. Chairs nudged an inch, eyes finding the floor. And Preacher did not raise his voice or make a single demand. He found a plastic chair bolted to the wall, and he sat down in it, and he took off his cap and held it in both hands between his knees. An old man turning a cap over and over, the way another kind of man works a set of beads. And he waited. Denny's wife came in near 10 o'clock, a woman named Carol, 58 years old, and she had driven the 40 miles with her hands shaking on the wheel the whole way. And when she saw a preacher sitting there with his cap in his hands, she did not have to ask if it was bad. She could read it off him the way you read weather off a sky. And she sat down next to the old man, and he put one heavy hand over both of hers, and neither of them said anything at all for a long time. The only sound in that room was the vending machine in the corner, cycling its compressor on and off, a low mechanical hum that came and went, the kind of sound you only notice when there is nothing left to say and too much of it. And here is the part the town never knew, the part that got left out of every version of this story that circulated afterward. Somewhere around midnight, a young prospect, a kid of maybe 24 who had ridden in with the 4, could not sit still any longer, and he leaned over to Preacher and asked, low, the question the whole room was thinking, which was, who? Who was the man that stopped? Some drifter, somebody had said. Some homeless guy off the overpass. And the way the kid said it, homeless guy, it came out small. The way a word comes out of a mouth that has already decided the man behind it does not amount to much. And Preacher turned his head and looked at that prospect for a long moment, and he said one thing, quiet, that the kid carried the rest of his life. He said, that man had $4,000 in his hand, and he was sleeping in the dirt, and he gave it back. You tell me what kind of man does that. And then you tell me again about the drifter. And the kid did not have an answer, because there is not one. And he looked at the floor the way the whole town would eventually be made to look at the floor. And he did not say the word homeless like that again. Now, all through that long night in the waiting room, while 4 bikers and a frightened wife and 1 old man sat listening to a vending machine breathe, the man who had bought Denny those extra minutes was 40 miles away, and he did not know a single thing about any of it. Earl had walked back to the overpass in the last of the light, and he had done what he did every evening of the last 2 years, which was almost nothing at all. And yet it was the most careful nothing you ever saw. He shook out his blanket. He set his boots where he could reach them without looking. He ate half of what he had and saved the other half, because a man who has been hungry does not eat the last of anything if he can help it. And then he sat with his back against the cold concrete pillar that held up the road, the same road, and he looked at his hands in the dark. There was still blood on them, dried brown in the creases and under the nails, another man's blood. And Earl did not scrub at it the way most people would have. He just looked at it for a while, the way you look at a thing that means more than you have words for. And then he reached into the garbage bag and pulled out the one thing in this world he had refused to sell. A steel toolbox, dented and old, and he set it on his knees and rested both hands flat on the lid. He did not open it. He never opened it out there. He just held his hands on it in the dark under the highway, the way a man rests his hand on a headstone. And after a while, his lips moved, and he said something to somebody who was not there, the way he did most nights. And then he put the box away and lay down. He did not know Denny's name. He did not know the club had come. He did not know that 40 miles north an old man was turning a cap over in his hands, and a surgeon was about to walk into a waiting room with news. Earl figured he had done a thing that was between him and his own conscience and nobody else, the way he figured most things now. and he slept. And the traffic ran over his head all night, the way it always did. That steady river of people going somewhere. None of them stopping. None of them the wiser. I want you to sit in that picture for a second, because it is the whole story in one frame before the story even gets going. 63 years old, blood on his hands from saving a stranger who had exactly the same amount of nothing to gain. Sleeping in the dirt under the feet of a town that would have crossed the street to avoid him in daylight, with a locked steel box for a pillow, and a name nobody had spoken with any weight in 2 years. And 40 miles away, in a bright room that smelled of floor cleaner and cold coffee, a whole different kind of family was already deciding, without having met him, that a debt had been opened that would not be closing quietly. That is the thing about that old rule, the one older than the patch. It does not care whether the man it is owed to knows he is owed. It does not care whether he ever asks. It comes looking on its own. The surgeon came out a little after 2 in the morning, still in the cap and the gown, pulling the mask down off his face, and he found a waiting room where nobody was asleep, and he did the thing surgeons do where they say the outcome with their eyes a half-second before their mouth catches up. Carol was on her feet before he got the first word out. Preacher stood up slower, the way his knees allowed, and he put his cap back on his head, and he waited to be told whether the calm he had held on to for 6 hours was going to have to become something else. The vending machine cycled on again in the corner. Somebody's chair scraped. And the surgeon looked at the wife, and then he looked at the old man in the cut, because he could tell the old man was the one who would need to carry the answer back to wherever the rest of them were waiting. And he told them what the last 6 hours had bought. Denny lived. He should not have, by the arithmetic of blood loss and time, but he did. And the surgeon told his wife it was the pressure somebody kept on that hip in the first minutes that bought the margin, that another few minutes and the man was gone, and that whoever it was out there on that road had likely done the exact right thing without a lick of training. Except Earl had every lick of training. Earl had held pressure on worse than a hip in a place worse than a highway when he was younger than the medic who took over. But nobody in that hospital knew that, and nobody knew Earl's name past a first name on a deputy's form. And for 3 days, it looked like the whole thing would end there. One more good deed swallowed by a town that could not see the man who did it. Then Denny woke up. And the first thing a certain kind of man does when he wakes up alive against the odds is he starts asking who stopped, who knelt, who had $4,000 in his hand and gave it back. Denny remembered a face over him, gray hair and an army jacket, and a voice that said, "You're not out here alone." And he remembered the hands, and he remembered, right at the edge before the dark, the man tucking the wallet back against his chest. Denny told that story from a hospital bed to his wife, and his wife told Preacher, and Preacher went very quiet. The kind of quiet that in that club meant something was about to be set in motion that no institution in that county could stop. And here is where the shape of the whole thing changed, because Preacher did not do what you might expect. He did not send men to find Earl and hand him an envelope of cash and call it square, though the club would have done that in a heartbeat and thought nothing of it. Preacher was 68, and he had buried more brothers than he had fingers, and he had learned that the men most worth honoring are the ones who will refuse an envelope. So the first thing Preacher did was go find out who the man in the army jacket was. It took 2 days. A deputy remembered the name Earl. A woman at a shelter remembered a quiet man who never took a bed if a family needed it, and gave his own blanket away twice that she saw. An old mechanic across the county, retired now, heard the description and the first name, and set down his coffee and said, "A full name," Preacher wrote down. And then that old mechanic said something else that made Preacher sit down slow. He said, "If that's the Earl I'm thinking of, then you boys have got no idea who you're dealing with. That man ran the cleanest shop in 3 counties for 19 years, and never once took a dollar he didn't earn. And before that, son, before that, he was somewhere the government still won't put on paper, doing things they gave him a medal for, and then asked him never to talk about. The kind you earn and bleed for, and some men never live long enough to actually wear. And he's living under an overpass, and nobody in this town lifted a finger." That old mechanic's name was Sam, and Sam is the man who finally cracked it all open, because Sam remembered one more thing. He remembered that Earl had a steel toolbox he never sold, not through the hole, slide down. And Sam said, "Whatever's in that box is the only thing that man's got left of who he was. And if you want to know Earl, you find out why a starving man wouldn't sell a locked box." Preacher found Earl on a Thursday at the overpass, and he came alone, on foot, and he was careful to come in Earl's line of sight from a good distance, so as not to startle a man who slept light. Earl watched him come. 68, gray beard, cut with more patches and rockers than Earl could read, walking with the small hitch of an old riding injury. And Earl knew the walk of a man carrying old damage the way he knew his own. Preacher stopped 10 feet off and did not offer his hand, because you do not walk up on a man's home and stick your hand at his face. And he said, "My brother's alive because of you." Earl said nothing. Preacher said, "He had $4,000 in that wallet, and you put it back." Earl said, "It wasn't mine." 3 words. And Preacher, who had spent 50 years reading men, heard in those 3 flat words everything Sam had tried to tell him. And he sat down slow on the concrete, right there, an old outlaw in the dirt next to a homeless veteran. And he said, "Tell me about the box." Earl didn't tell him about the box, not that day. But he let Preacher sit, and the 2 old men watched the traffic go by under the overpass, the same traffic that had driven past Denny bleeding. And after a long while, Earl said one thing. He said, "Don't bring me money." And Preacher said, "I wasn't going to." And that was the whole conversation, near enough. 2 men who had both been to the far edge of what a person can do to another person, and both chosen to walk back, sitting in the shade of a highway, understanding each other with almost no words at all. Because that's the thing the 11 cars never understood about either of them. But Preacher stood up eventually, and his old knees told him about it, and before he left, he said one more thing, quiet, almost to himself. He said, "My brother's got 149 friends who'd like to shake your hand." And Earl, who had not been touched by another human being in kindness in longer than he'd let himself count, looked at the concrete and said nothing. And Preacher took the nothing for the not yet that it was, and walked back to his bike. Now I could tell you the club just rolled up and made everything right, and you'd feel good for a minute, and you'd click away, and you'd forget it by supper. So I'm not going to do that, because what actually happened is better, and it is slower, and it will stay with you. Because when Preacher told the chapter Earl's story, and told them what Sam had said, and told them a decorated combat veteran who had saved one of their own was sleeping under a bridge in a town that filmed a dying man and drove on, something moved through those 150 riders, that was older and heavier than gratitude. It was shame on behalf of a whole country that does this to its old men. And it was rage held on a very short leash, and it was a debt. And there is nothing in this world a club like that takes more seriously than a debt. But Preacher held them. He said, "You do not roll 150 bikes into that town and scare it into being decent. Because scared decency doesn't last past the taillights." He said, "We're going to do this a different way." And here is the thing about the shame that was moving through that room. It should have been moving through the town. And in about 6 days, it was going to. What Preacher did was ask around, quiet, the way he'd asked around to find Earl. And he found out the town had a little diner, the kind with a counter and 8 stools and a pie case, run by a widow named Fay, who was 66, and who was, as it turned out, one of maybe 3 people in that whole town who had never once looked away from Earl. Fay fed Earl. Not showy about it, never made him take it in front of anyone, just left a plate on the far end of the counter most mornings, and turned her back so he could eat with what dignity a man's got left, and never charged him a cent, and never told a soul. Fay was fighting the bank herself, quietly, the way everybody in that town was quietly losing to something. Because the diner had been her husband's, and the taxes had gone up, and the county had a fellow, a suit named Marsh, who worked for the outfit buying up the whole Main Street cheap. And Marsh had made it clear that Fay's diner was next, one way or another. And Preacher, sitting at Fay's counter drinking coffee he didn't need, watching this widow refill an old trucker's cup with hands that shook just slightly from tiredness, and hearing how she fed a homeless veteran out of her own thin margin, while a man in a gray suit circled her business like weather. Preacher put down his cup and understood that the debt he owed Earl and the thing being done to Fay were, at the bottom of it, the same thing. A town that had stopped valuing the people who kept it decent. And so the plan changed shape one more time. They picked a Saturday, and in the 6 days before it, Preacher did the patient, unglamorous work that nobody makes a movie about. He had a lawyer in the club, a real one, look at what Marsh's outfit was doing to Fay and to 4 other businesses on that street, and the lawyer found what men like Marsh always leave behind, which is a paper trail that assumes nobody will ever read it. He had 2 brothers who did construction quietly measure the diner and price out what it would take to fix the roof and the walk-in that Fay couldn't afford to fix. And he sent Sam, the old mechanic, to sit with Earl 3 afternoons running, just to sit, 2 old men and a thermos, until on the 3rd afternoon, Earl finally reached into the garbage bag and pulled out the steel toolbox and set it between them and opened it. Sam looked inside for a long time and did not touch anything, and then he took off his cap, an old man taking off his cap in the dirt under a highway. And Earl closed the box again and put it away, and neither of them said what was in it, and neither of them needed to. But Sam went back to Preacher and said, "Now I know exactly who that man is. And I'll tell you this, whatever we do Saturday, we do it right. Because that man has earned right and got given nothing. And I'll not be part of getting it a little bit wrong." Saturday morning, Earl woke up under the overpass the way he did every morning, and he did not know a single thing about what was coming. And I want you to sit in that with me, because the not knowing is the whole gift. He walked his usual walk to Fay's, planning to take his plate at the far end of the counter and be gone before the churchgoers came. Except the road into town did not sound right. Earl stopped and listened the way his body still listened, and what he heard, coming from a long way off and building, was thunder that was not weather. It was engines, many of them, But the man Earl used to be does not disappear just because you feed him out of kindness. For one bad second, hearing that many bikes come up on a town, the old Earl stood up inside him and started counting. Exits, angles, cover. The cold arithmetic of a man who had once had to think that way to live. And then he made himself breathe, and he made himself walk toward the sound instead of away. Because he had decided a long time ago, out loud, over a grave, that he was done being the man who assumed the worst of the world. So Earl walked into town on a Saturday morning toward 150 engines. An old veteran in a shiny army jacket carrying nothing. And he had no earthly idea he was walking into the thing that was going to give him his life back. They filled the street. 150 motorcycles, parked in ranks that would have made a drill sergeant weep. From the diner all the way down past the 4 other businesses Marsh's outfit was squeezing. And the riders stood by their bikes. And they were not shouting, and they were not tearing anything up. They were just there. A wall of leather and gray beards, and young men both. Quiet. The way a thing is quiet right before it means something. And every soul in that town came out to look. The woman who sped past, the man who filmed, the medic who counted the cash twice, the deputy, and the suit named Marsh, who came out of his office pulling out his phone to call somebody. Because a man like Marsh has never in his life met a problem he couldn't call somebody about. And Earl stopped at the edge of it, and the whole street of riders turned and looked at him, and for a moment, nobody in that town understood what they were seeing. Why 150 of the most feared men in 3 states had come to stand in the road, and were now all looking at a homeless man in an army jacket. And then Denny came out of the diner.
On a cane, pale, 61 years old and stitched back together, walking slow. And he walked the length of that street to Earl. And the whole town watched a full-patch Hell's Angel stop in front of a homeless man, and, with tears standing in his eyes, put out his hand and say, "You didn't leave me in the dirt." Earl took his hand. And that was the moment the town's story about both of them broke apart in the street where everyone could see it. Because then Preacher stepped up, 68 and steady, and he did not speak to Earl. He turned and spoke to the town. And he did not raise his voice, and that was what made it terrible. He said, "This man is Earl." And he named the full name Sam had given him. And he said a rank, and he said the name of a place the government still won't put on paper. And he said, "This man held my brother's life in his bare hands on your road, and gave back $4,000 he could have kept. And he has been sleeping under your overpass for 2 years, while every one of you looked the other way. 11 of you drove past my brother bleeding out. I counted, 11. And a homeless man was the only one of you with anything left worth calling a soul." And the street was so quiet you could hear the pie case humming through the diner's open door. That was the ambient sound of a whole town being shown itself. This is where a lesser story would turn ugly, with 150 would turn on the town. That is not what happened, because Preacher had learned the thing that Earl already knew, which is that the strongest thing a powerful man can do is not the thing everyone's afraid he'll do. So Preacher did not point those men at anyone. Instead, he called Marsh out by name, the suit with the phone. And he did not threaten him. He simply had the club lawyer step forward with a folder, and the lawyer said in a calm courtroom voice exactly which laws Marsh's outfit had broken, squeezing Fay and the other 4, dates and dollar amounts, and the names of the county officials who'd looked the other way for a cut. All of it already filed with people in the state capitol that morning, copies already with 3 newspapers. And Marsh's face did the thing men's faces do when they realize the somebody they were going to call is already on the other side. You could watch the math land in real time. There was no fight. There was never going to be a fight. There was just a suit in the middle of a street full of witnesses, holding a dead phone, learning that the debt he'd been running up on a widow had come due in front of the entire town at once. And then the riders did the thing they'd actually come to do. They went to work. Those 2 brothers who did construction pulled tools off a trailer and started on Faye's roof that same morning. Others carried lumber, and the walk-in got fixed, and somebody's wife, who'd ridden in from 3 counties over, sat down with Faye at the counter with the club lawyer and started untangling the tax mess the honest way, the slow way, the way that would actually hold. And Denny, leaning on his cane, walked Earl down the street past all 150 of those bikes, and every single man reached out as he passed, not to grab him, just to touch his shoulder, his arm, the way men do when words are too small. 150 hands on an old veteran who had not been touched in kindness in 2 years. And Earl, who had not let himself cry through the loss of Ruth and the house and the shop and everything. Earl finally put his cracked hand over his face and let it come, right there in the street, held up by strangers who were about to stop being strangers. They did not hand Earl an envelope. Preacher had promised him that on the first day, and Preacher was a man who kept his word. What they did instead was harder, and it was permanent. The club owned a piece of property outside town, a shuttered garage with a little apartment over it, and they had spent the 6 days quietly getting it deeded clean and the power turned on. And Preacher put the key in Earl's hand and said, "This is a shop, and it needs a man who knows engines. And my brother tells me there's 150 bikes in this club that all need working on, and 1 man in this county we'd trust to touch them. It's not charity, it's a debt, and a job, and you'd be doing us the favor." Earl looked at the key in his hand, and he looked at Preacher, and he understood the difference, that these men had found the one way to give him everything back without taking his dignity as the price, by making it work, by making it earned, by pretending, kindly, that he was doing them the favor. And Earl, who had said 3 words in the gravel and 3 words at the overpass, said 3 words again. He said, 6 days a week. And Preacher, who understood exactly what that meant, that Earl was telling him a man who opens at 6 days a week is a man who is coming all the way back. Preacher laughed, an old man's rough laugh, and said, "Take Sundays, Earl. Even God did." The consequences rolled out over the weeks after, the slow procedural way real consequences do. Marsh's outfit collapsed inside a month, the way these things collapse once the paper's in the right hands and the newspapers have the names, and 2 county officials resigned and 1 was charged, and the 4 businesses on that street that had been circling the drain reclaimed themselves, one by one. The barber first, and the little hardware store last. And Faye's diner not only survived, it got a new roof and a walk-in that worked, and a permanent booth in the corner that she kept for the riders, and would not let anyone else sit in. The medic who had counted the cash twice came to the new shop one afternoon, stood in the doorway a while, and finally said he was sorry, that he'd looked at Earl and seen a story instead of a man. And Earl wiped his hands on a rag and said the only thing he ever said about any of it, which was, "Most people do," and shook the young man's hand, and that was that. The town that had filmed a dying man decided, collectively and without ever discussing it, to become a town that told a different story about itself. And the different story was true enough now that they were allowed to tell it. And the box. The steel toolbox Earl carried through every hungry month and would not sell.
It sat on a shelf in the new shop, up high, where Earl could see it while he worked, and he never opened it again that anyone saw, and nobody ever asked, because by then, everyone who needed to know already knew what a man like that keeps locked away, and why he doesn't need to look at it to know it's there. It sat up on that shelf year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Earl ran that shop for 11 more years, opened at 6, took his Sundays, fixed 150 bikes and then some, and became, without ever once trying to, the quiet center of that whole club, the old man they leaned toward when he spoke. He and Denny never talked much about that day on the highway, but something had shifted between them that never needed words again. And when Earl died, at 74, in his own bed over his own shop, half that town came to the funeral, and the whole club came. 150 engines idling low in front of a little diner, and Fay kept the corner booth empty that day and every day after, and the shop kept his hours, 6 days a week, run by a young rider Earl had taught, because that was simply how the place ran now. So think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A man in the dirt. 11 cars. A fat wallet 6 feet from a starving man's hand. It looked, in that first moment, like the whole cold machinery of a world that had stopped caring. The strong driving past the dying, the comfortable filming the desperate. A good man left to rot under a bridge because his clothes told an easy story. But that's the thing about the quiet ones, the ones we drive past. The quiet isn't nothing. Sometimes the quiet is a man who has already been everywhere a person can go and decided, on purpose, on his knees in the gravel where no one was watching, to be better than the world was to him. What those 11 drivers should have seen was not a homeless man, and not a patch on a dying stranger's back. What they should have seen was 2 kinds of men the world had written off, an old outlaw and a broken veteran, who between them still carried more of what a country's supposed to be than the whole street of respectable people watching from behind their windows. A debt of kindness is the only thing in this life that pays interest, and it always, always comes due. Earl put a wallet back because it wasn't his, and 150 men he'd never met tore the roof off his old life and built him a new one. Not because they had to, but because that is what you do for a man who kneels when everyone else drives on. Now the wallet and the bikes, honestly, that's the least interesting part of all this to me. What I keep sitting with is that plate Fay left on the end of her counter every morning for 2 years, turning her back so a proud man could eat, telling no one. That's where the whole thing actually started, long before the crash. So let me ask you something, and I read every single comment on this channel, every one. When you picture yourself in one of those 11 cars, slowing down, seeing the blood and the patch, feeling your foot move toward the gas, be honest with yourself. Which one were you? And which one do you want to be next time? Tell me down below. And if you're new here, this is the kind of place where we tell stories about the people the world underestimates, the quiet ones, the ones who kept their word when it stopped being fashionable to keep it. And if that's your kind of story, pull up a chair and stay a while. Subscribe and ride with us. There are 2 more stories waiting for you on the screen right now. One about a diner waitress and a table full of men who forgot who they were talking to. And one about a Marine's funeral that the whole town tried to skip. Thank you for staying to the end. It says something about you that you did. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the kinds of quiet decency and hard loyalty that real people show every day, and any resemblance to actual persons or events is entirely coincidental. And it was made only to sit with you a while and remind you that the man everyone drives past
is almost never the man they think he is.